How many times have we begged life to explain itself, only to be met with silence? How many nights have we lain awake, asking why something good fell apart, or why something painful ever had to happen at all? The truth is, we are creatures who crave answers immediately, but life rarely gives them on our sketchable. What looks senseless today can become the clearest sense we've ever made of anything years from now. Today's story is about an old potter and his granddaughter, and a single broken jar that taught her something no school, no book, and no well-meaning relative ever could. The quiet, uncomfortable art of trusting a reason she couldn't yet see. So stay with this story until the very end, because by the time it's done, you may never look at your own broken pieces the same way again. In a quiet town where the river bent gently around a hill of red clay, there lived an old potter named Devrath. His hands were rough and cracked from decades of shaping earth into vessels, water jugs, oil lamps, cooking pots, and the wide-mouthed jars villagers used to store grain through the long dry months. He was not famous, he was not wealthy, but everyone in that town at some point had carried water in something his hands had made. He lived with his granddaughter, Meera, a bright, impatient girl of 16 who had grown up watching her grandfather work the wheel, but had never once shown interest in learning it. She wanted quick things, quick answers, quick results, quick fixes. If a plan didn't work in a day, she called it a failure. If a friendship faded, she called it a waste. She often said to her grandfather, "Why does everything in your work take so long? Why not just make it and be done?" And Devrath would only smile and say, "The clay decides when it is ready, not us." One evening, Meera was helping in the workshop when she noticed a jar sitting alone in the corner, half-finished, with a long crack running from its rim down to its base. "Why haven't you thrown this one out?" she asked. "It's ruined." Devrath picked it up gently, turning it in his hands like something precious. "This jar isn't ruined," he said. "It's resting. Sometimes clay cracks, not because it failed, but because it needs to be reshaped into something it wasn't ready to become yet." Meera rolled her eyes. To her, a crack was a crack. Broken was broken. There was no poetry in it. A few weeks later, disaster struck the town. A sudden storm flooded the fields just before harvest, and half the village's grain stores were ruined by water damage. Families panicked. The town elder called an emergency meeting, and among the concerns raised was that there weren't enough proper storage jars to salvage what grain remained before it spoiled further. Meera, desperate to help, remembered the cracked jar in the corner of the workshop and, without asking, threw it onto the reject pile with the others. Jars she assumed were now completely useless for anything. Her grandfather noticed it missing that night. He said nothing to her, only walked quietly to the reject pile behind the workshop and searched until he found it. He carried it back inside without a word. The following morning, an unexpected visitor arrived, a traveling grain merchant named Kishore, passing through to assess the flood damage for trade purposes. He wandered past the potter's yard and noticed the reject pile, jars deemed too flawed to sell. He picked up one specifically, a wide, cracked storage jar, and turned it over in the light. "This crack," he said slowly, "it doesn't go all the way through. It stops just above the base." Devrath nodded. "I noticed the same thing weeks ago." Kishore explained that a jar cracked in that exact pattern
if sealed carefully along the crack with wax and clay paste, could actually hold grain far longer than an ordinary jar, because the trapped air pocket the crack created would slow moisture from ruining the harvest inside. It was, ironically, better for storing damp, flood-affected grain than a perfect jar would have been. Meera stood frozen. The very flaw she had dismissed as worthless was now the one thing that could save part of the village's remaining harvest. Her grandfather sealed the jar exactly as Kishore described, and within days, 3 families were using similarly cracked jars Meera had once thrown away without a second thought, to preserve what little grain they had left until the next planting season came. That evening, Meera sat beside her grandfather at the wheel, quieter than usual. "I almost threw away the one thing that ended up helping people," she said softly. "I judged it before I understood it." Devrath kept working the clay beneath his palms, not looking up right away. "That is the mistake most people make, my dear. We look at a crack, a delay, a failure, a heartbreak, and we call it the end of the story. But it is rarely the end. It is simply a page we haven't finished reading yet." Meera didn't fully understand, not yet, but something in her had shifted. Months passed, the harvest recovered. Life in the village slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Then, quietly, without announcement, Devrath grew ill. His hands, once so steady on the wheel, began to tremble. He could no longer shape the clay the way he once had. Meera, terrified of losing him, began spending every free hour in the workshop, not out of duty this time, but out of love, trying desperately to learn everything he knew before it was too late. At first, her pots came out lopsided, cracked, ruined by her own old definition. She wanted to give up more than once. But she remembered the jar. She remembered the crack that saved the harvest, and instead of throwing her failed pieces away, she began studying why they cracked, where the clay was too thin, where she'd rushed the drying, where impatience had shown up in her hands before she even noticed it in her mind. Slowly, painfully, she got better. Not because failure stopped happening, but because she stopped calling every failure a verdict. By the time Devrath's hands could no longer work the wheel at all, Meera's could. She took over the workshop fully, the same workshop she once thought she'd never care for. And years later, when people asked her how she learned to make jars so fine that even cracked ones seemed to serve a purpose, she would only smile the way her grandfather once had and say, "The clay decides when it is ready, not us." This story teaches us 3 things we can all carry into our own lives. First, stop labeling a moment as good or bad before its story has finished unfolding. What looks broken today may be exactly the shape something needs tomorrow. Second, look closer at your own cracks, the delays, the setbacks, the things that didn't go as planned, because sometimes the flaw is the function, not the failure. And third, patience is not passive waiting. It is active trust, the willingness to keep showing up, even when the reason hasn't revealed itself yet. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times did something fall apart, only for you to realize months or years later that it had to fall apart exactly that way for something better to take its place? A relationship that ended so a healthier one could begin. A job that was lost so a truer path could open. A plan that cracked right down the middle
so something stronger could be built from its pieces. We rarely get to see the reason in the moment. We only get to see it in hindsight, if we're patient enough to wait for it. So the next time life hands you something that feels like a crack, a delay, a disappointment, resist the urge to call it ruined. Everything happens for a reason, even when the reason takes its time to show itself.
Now, I want to hear from you. Think of a moment in your life that felt like a crack at the time, but turned out to be exactly what shaped you. Share it in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If this story moved you, please like and share this video and subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you stories that inspire and uplift. I'll be back again with another powerful story. Until then, be patient, stay grateful, and trust the shape life is quietly forming in you.